Hello and welcome to The World This Week. We are live here in Paris. I'm Gavin Lee. Let's take a look at the last 7 days. It's been a week of diplomatic engagement between the US and Iran. Special envoy Steve Witkoff, once again Washington's front man to see if Iran will curb or eliminate its attempts to make a nuclear weapon. Mediation in Muscat and mixed messages too, with a weakened Iran reported to be closer than ever to developing a nuclear bomb, but with Israel reportedly pushing to strike its facilities within weeks, and Iran suddenly proposing Russia as a key mediator.
We are hopeful and expect that in any future agreement over Iran's nuclear program that Russia will continue its helpful role. And I'm very happy today that Mr. Lavrov gave me such an assurance.
It's been a week. The US Secretary of State has said Washington is ready to move on and abandon trying to broker a peace deal with Moscow in Ukraine unless, said Marco Rubio, speaking in Paris, there are clear signs from President Putin within days. But will it be done quickly is the message, which also applies to the deal offered to Ukraine to allow US access to its raw minerals. It's emerged today that the outline of the deal has now been signed, 7 weeks to the day that things fell apart in the Oval Office row. Relations aren't much rosier, though, it seems, with Trump telling reporters this week that Zelensky shared the blame for the killings in a war he started. He later rolled back on those comments slightly.
I'm not blaming him, but what I am saying is that I wouldn't say he's done the greatest job, okay? I'm not a big fan.
And it's been a week that's seen a landmark ruling in London with the Supreme Court clarifying how women should be defined in UK law, determining that the term woman refers to biological sex and that a transgender woman with a gender recognition certificate is not included in a legal definition of a woman, and therefore affirming the right to single-sex spaces and services including refuges, prisons, hospital wards and sports clubs. We'll look at the international implications of the UK ruling.
Decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
It's been a week that's seen an all-female part celebrity crew take one small step towards space tourism and one giant, much ridiculed leap to the Kármán line and back again. A round trip where space begins in 10 minutes and 20 seconds. The team on board, Jeff Bezos' Blue Horizon rocket, experienced a moment of weightlessness and arguably the first live mini-concert in space, with pop star Katy Perry providing the intergalactic entertainment. Welcome to The World This Week. On the panel tonight, we have from the Ukraine capital, Liliane Bivings, business editor at the Kyiv Independent. Hello, Liliane. Fantastic to have you with us. On the issue of what we've just seen there, that the space ride with Jeff Bezos, $150,000 to reserve your seat. We don't know if they pay, but in general, would you have taken a ride if it was offered to you? 10 minutes to space and back?
No, probably not. I think personally, there's more important things to do here on Earth that are way more urgent than taking a 10-minute trip up to space. But that's just me. Which gets to the core of what we will talk about: cheap publicity stunt or a bigger mission for humankind. Well, let's go from Kyiv to the US Capitol. Holly Dagress is with us, seasoned Iran commentator, senior analyst at the Washington Institute and curator of Iranist.com Substack. Holly, thank you for joining us as well. I note in your article in the Iranist this week a very useful reader's guide to this week's nuclear talks, including whether they were direct, indirect talks, subheading potato, potato. Tell us about that.
Yes, I mean, it was quite the lead up to the talks. A lot of us were very confused about what was going to happen. And in the end, from according to reports, they did indirect and also direct talks. And actually, the direct talks allegedly lasted anywhere from a few minutes to 45 minutes, the latter bit being from Axios. So both sides arguably got what they wanted in the end in Oman.
We're going to get on to the detailed implications, and it'll be really interesting to hear your voice on this shortly. Great to have you with us, Holly. And to our friends in the studio, Vivian Walt, Paris-based correspondent for Time magazine. Viv, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for being here. Tell us about what you've been working on this week or looking at in the last few days.
Well, not Iran, as a matter of fact, or Ukraine. I have been reporting somewhat on the fallout of this war that Trump has declared against academics and universities, and how this might benefit Europe, with Europe's top schools seeing this as a golden moment for them. So I've been speaking to a lot of people about that, speaking to American students who've actually decided not to go back from semesters abroad or to take offers that are being offered to them in Europe. These European schools are being flooded with resumes from Harvard, Stanford, the top schools in America. So they see it as a kind of once-in-a-generation moment, and perhaps like the silver lining in what's been a pretty rocky few months.
It's very interesting, actually, capitalising on the so-called brain drain from US universities.
Absolutely.
Just don't let J.D. Vance know on Signalgate. That will come up again about those pesky Europeans, to which we can bring in, not a pesky European, but Richard Worley, our friend in the studio and correspondent for the Swiss publication Blick. Richard, I know, I should also say author of The Ball of Illusions, how France sees itself and how the world sees France. Richard, you were trying to, last time we spoke, get into Myanmar in the aftermath of the earthquake. Very difficult, often closed to foreign correspondents. How did you get on?
Well, that was actually very depressing scenes that we saw in Myanmar. Managed to access Mandalay, the second biggest city after Yangon, which was clearly shaken by the earthquake. We saw a lot of images from Mandalay, but not being able to access Naypyidaw, the capital city. And that is the most frustrating, because Naypyidaw, being a capital city built by the military regime, built largely by Chinese construction company, a lot of buildings have been flattened by the earthquake, but you've seen no photo of them, no pictures. So what happened in Naypyidaw remained completely closed up, because the military power in Myanmar doesn't want to show how much it was damaged. And I think that's a pity, because we will probably never know how many people died there. They are now talking about 4,000 victims of the earthquake, but the figures that everybody has in mind, especially in the NGO community, is something around probably 15 to 20,000.
I mean, I've covered earthquakes before, natural disasters. They are very hard to report in themselves, to live reporting on the ground. So credit to you for trying to get in and trying to see that. Richard, great to have you on the programme. And it takes us to the beginning this week, Ukraine. Palm Sunday, 10:15 in the morning in the city of Sumy, 25 kilometres from the Russian border, close to the front line fighting, but where ordinary life was carrying on. Families out in the streets, heading to church, going about civilian life, then civilian loss, when 2 Russian ballistic missiles hit the city centre, one of them filmed by an eyewitness as it landed. More than 30 people were killed, including 2 children, more than 100 injured. There was international condemnation. Moscow claimed it was targeting a military meeting of Ukraine's 117th Territorial Defence Brigade. Reports that a medal ceremony had been taking place in the basement of a university building. Another moment of horror at a time Russia is said to be ramping up its so-called spring offensive. The Kyiv Independent reporting that it's already begun. Meanwhile, at the end of last week, Steve Witkoff was in St. Petersburg, meeting President Putin for the 3rd time in 3 months. This week, he was briefing European colleagues in Paris, alongside Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And after weeks of US-Russia diplomacy and rapprochement with Russia's leader, suddenly less carrot, more stick, Marco Rubio's latest message to Putin: we're getting ready to move on.
So if they're serious about peace, either side or both, we want to help. If it's not going to happen, then we're just going to move on.
Let's begin with Liliane in Kyiv. Interesting, we've also heard from President Trump tonight, sort of echoing, but not quite, Marco Rubio's message, saying that they would be prepared to move on. What's your take on this, the latest message?
Well, I think it signals more that the Trump administration is getting tired of the feet dragging that's happening on Russia's side, which was, predictable. If you look at the Sumy attack that happened on Sunday, right? Palm Sunday, people are out and about on a Sunday morning. Russia attacks the city with 2 ballistic missiles, one of which was cluster munitions that, explodes basically in the air, inflicts the maximum amount of damage on the people around, right? This is intended to inflict a lot of casualties and damage, right? And so if you look at an attack like that, you see that this is a side that is not interested in peace. Right. So I think the Trump administration, I don't know why they didn't know that beforehand, that Russia is not interested. I think people in Ukraine could have told you that. Russia was not going to be serious about making in Ukraine. So I think it's less about the U.S. ramping up pressure on Russia and saying, hey, you have another few days to make a deal. Because as the U.S. has not really had any pressure on Russia. There haven't been any real demands of Russia to make real concessions. Mm-hmm. I think it's a signal that the U.S. is ready to move on. They're tired of this, and they're bored because it's not happening as fast as they wanted or thought it.
And yet, Vivian, listening to Liliane, President Trump has been in office 3 months now, almost 100 days. At the end of this month, his team speak of achieving a peace deal in 100 days. If you're next on this programme and we're beyond that point, we'll be in the midst of a truce. Will it pull off despite all this carrot and stick approach?
Well, if you remember, Trump during the campaign promised to end the Ukraine war on day one. So here we are, 99 days nearly, too late, But I think what's interesting is if you listen to the whole remarks that Rubio made on the tarmac, we just had one little clip of it, but he actually said some things which were really quite reasonable. He said there's no military solution to this war, which I think we've been saying for a long time. So there's got to be a political solution. And he detects that certainly on one side, the Russian side, and I think they've come to realize this, there's absolutely no appetite for a ceasefire. In fact, the Kremlin came out today and said as much. They said they're in no rush to make a deal. So he wasn't completely off the wall by saying, we're going to move on. I think they realize that they might be kind of hitting their head against a brick wall at the moment. If they're going to force through a political deal, it's very much, what was just said. It's like, what's the conditions? And we don't know that. And those could be obviously extremely bad for Ukraine.
And in the midst of this vacuum, Vivian and Richard too, Europe and European leaders, European politicians come back into the frame a bit more, cast out before, kind of screaming like Banquo's ghost, remember us. And they were really deliberately moved out of the way, weren't they, in Saudi Arabia, those talks with Russia and the US. Now, they're being briefed today by Marco Rubio, by Steve Witkoff as well, Mr. Fix-It on all foreign affairs issues for President Trump. How do you assess Europe's role now? And, does it have any cards, to use Trump's term?
Well, if you listen carefully to and if you read the communiqué issued after yesterday's meeting in Paris, it's very, very difficult to know what they've been talking about because no details have been given. Then you've got one version, which is the version mainly carried out by the French media, that this was a diplomatic victory for France, that France is now back at the center stage, that Macron is also kind of the leader of a possible diplomatic solution and an involvement of Europeans in that future peace talks. That's the version we have from the French media. And now you have Rubio saying, we may finally decide to let Ukraine go because we have other things to work on. What worries me is the blame game maybe starting in the US. They know they cannot. They have realized that they cannot convince Putin, so they have to find a culprit. And the culprit cannot be Donald Trump, because as you know, Gavin and Vivian and everybody around this panel, Mr. Trump is always right. He cannot be wrong. So somebody's got to take the blame. And what I'm afraid of is that may be the first step of kind of blame game against the European. At the end, you'll see Donald Trump in the White House saying, I wanted peace, I was ready to make peace, but because the European, we couldn't achieve it.
Yes.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Well, we see all sorts of people getting blamed. There are those around Donald Trump and many reporters suggesting that Marco Rubio may be first to go in the domestic blame game. But Liliane, there's also sparring going on this week restarted, hasn't there, between Kyiv and Washington? I see Vladimir Zelensky talking about Steve Witkoff in Moscow's disinformation space. He used similar terms for President Trump. And we've seen President Trump blaming Zelensky for sharing and blaming the war, rolling back, but saying, essentially, I don't like this guy.
Yeah, I mean, put very simply, and maybe this is just my personal feeling about it, but I think it's fair to say that the things that Donald Trump says, that Witkoff says, they are directly out of the Kremlin's mouth. I mean, if you follow Kremlin propaganda, if you have been following it for years, like many people in Ukraine have been or have been exposed to it, you recognize the things he's saying. And I get the feeling sometimes that they have conversations with Putin, whom we know they admire, Trump and Witkoff. He tells them things about Ukraine being a fake state, about how all of those territories are Russian speaking and they really just want to be part of Russia. There were referenda where they voted to be part of Russia. Of course, Putin doesn't mention that those people were asked to vote at gunpoint. The soldiers came to houses with guns and ballot boxes. Doesn't mention it. And then they think this all sounds pretty reasonable, and then they repeat it. Of course, he doesn't say very nice things about Zelensky. Trump then repeats it. Of course, we know Trump doesn't like Zelensky because he's the reason behind, he feels he's the reason behind his first impeachment, right? But these things are very worrying, obviously, that the President of the United States of America and his team are repeating things that, come out of Russian propaganda. And Zelensky, as the president of Ukraine, feels his duty, out of respect for the dignity of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, to defend those, their honor and their dignity and call these untruths, even if that means calling out the president of the United States of America during a negotiation process.
And when we hear about the outline of a deal on minerals being agreed this week and signed, Liliane, presented by the US as a great minerals deal, but actually I just wonder whether you hear from politicians, sources, contacts in Kyiv who talk about, the fact that giving US access. I've heard terms like mafioso pressure before. How are you reading that when you have private conversations and different to the public rhetoric we hear?
Yeah, so I think one distinction that's very important to make is that the deal that was, that is being signed right now, this is basically a memorandum of understanding, which, memorandums of understanding are not really worth much more than the paper that they're written on, right? There's intention to do something at some point. And I think it was actually clever. I think, rightfully so, they drove a hard bargain. They were not just going to sign some agreement that gave away its sovereign resources to the US just like that. And they kind of, I think, slowed down the process a little bit and got it to roll back to this original just memorandum of understanding, which then afterwards, a formal kind of fund agreement that will govern the terms of the investment will be sorted out later, right? So they signed this memorandum now, and it looks like a victory for Trump, which is, as everybody knows, very important to Donald Trump, right? So this looks like a victory for him, and they can kind of move on from this. And they can let the fund deal, right, this actual technical agreement about the investment, get bogged down into sort of legal discussions. It'll need to be ratified by Parliament, which, from what I understand, the Ukrainian government purposefully set it up that way because they know that it's going to have a hard time getting through Parliament. Some kind of the deal as the Americans put it that way, right? And so I think this was actually done quite well on the Ukrainian side, in my view, to sort of drag it out and make sure that it made Trump look good, because look, he gets to brag, but not moving too quickly on the deal. Because as you said, what they were asking for was essentially like some mob style, we come in, we get a cut of everything. You can't do business unless you give us some of your money that you make, right? This typical kind of bandit style thing. And it disrupted Ukraine's EU integration, which is very, very important for Ukraine, and they weren't going to let that happen. So we'll see what happens, but my belief is that you won't see the actual deal either ever or for a time.
Very interesting. Memorandum of understanding, essentially talks around talks. Let's see where they go to. Talking of talks around talk, let's go to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Muscat. Saturday this week, 3:30 in the afternoon, secretive, mediated talks between Iranian and US officials began. The Americans demanding Tehran stop developing a nuclear weapon, that Iran demanding Washington lift sanctions that are worsening its economic crisis. The talks were so secretive, the Iranian state TV was provided the only updates afterwards. President Trump has spoken about live crews being there. That didn't happen. Constructive, friendly were the terms used by both sides. A second day of talks arranged for Rome on Saturday. This was the readout from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. She talked about there being a maximum pressure campaign that was working so far. So what really went on in the room? What does Iran want from these talks? Let's bring in Holly in DC. Holly, what is your understanding of what actually happened?
Well, it's interesting because the Iranians initially were controlling the information flow. We saw the Iranian foreign ministry tweet out in English that the talks were indirect. And then we also saw that the United States only reacted hours after the fact. But the main point was that both Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi saw these as positive and constructive talks, and the U.S. did as well. What was noteworthy about the past week is the change of venue. There was a lot of confusion. First they said Oman, then they said Italy, then it went back to Oman, and now we're back at Italy. And what's noteworthy about Italy, it seems that it's hard for U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to actually make that long travel, given all the international travel he's been doing. So they thought that Italy would be a good place. And according to reports, the Iranians preferred Italy over E3 countries like France, Britain, and Germany, who may be involved in snapback sanctions on Iran that are due in October. And so that's been really the thinking right now. But just to unpack what are these conversations, I think there's a lot of confusion about what the Trump administration wants. We've seen in the past that Special Envoy Witkoff has said that they want a peaceful, verifiable nuclear agreement, and President Donald Trump has said the same thing. But we've also seen National Security Advisor Mike Waltz say they want a full dismantlement of the country's nuclear program, a la Libya. And so there was a bit of that conversation happening after the Oman talks. We saw that actually Witkoff went on television and said that they would be happy with a deal that allowed Iran to enrich 3.67% enriched uranium, which is actually what was found in the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that Trump withdrew from in 2018, despite Tehran not violating the deal. Then we saw a reverse from Witkoff himself saying that actually, no, that's not what we're going to be doing. We want a full dismantlement. Yeah, so there's a lot of things happening, but the most noteworthy bit about that last point is that the Iranians said they'll just trust what the U.S. says behind closed doors, not what they're saying publicly.
Yes, so to curb, to eliminate. These aren't new ideas either, and I think you've also set this out previously, haven't you, Holly? You've looked and you've talked about three camps in the US administration. You've talked about J.D. Vance, who kind of previously has kind of wanted the US to be out of any involvement with war. Witkoff and Musk in the business of making deals. And you've talked about a third camp, the Hawks, talk about the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who knows the Iran file very well.
Yes, and I think that's where a lot of the divide's happening. The fact that Witkoff, within less than 24 hours, had to make a 180 on his initial statement about 3.67%. It was assumed that there was some closed-door meetings happening at the White House and that they were debating over this. And of course, Barak Ravid at Axios confirmed this, that there were two Iran meetings within the White House debating this very issue about how the path forward should be with Iran's nuclear program because of those very big divides between the isolationists like J.D. Vance and the Iran hawks like Mike Waltz and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So I think if they're not able to solve that key issue, because those are very different things, to ask Iran to fully dismantle its nuclear program versus actually allowing it to enrich uranium. So if they're able to actually decide on that by tomorrow, I think that will really give us a sense of where talks can go in the coming weeks.
Listening to you, Holly, Vivian, I want to bring you in here because is it too strong a term to think we are back from the brink here with talks? It's very hard to know because we've heard Trump talking about bombing Iran. We've heard the Israelis reports in the New York Times saying that they might strike in May, and it seems to have been waved away by Trump.
Well, there's certainly like war drums, shall we say. you know, the US has moved long-range missiles into Iraq, into striking distance of Iran. They're clearly threatening that there's going to be some kind of an attack. And in fact, they kind of blocked the plans for a joint attack with Israel next month, clearly waiting to see what's going to happen. I mean, this would be somewhat kind of, you know, if this weren't so really, truly serious, it would be a little bit ludicrous in the sense that here we are trying to negotiate with Iran a deal which is pretty much identical, as Holly says, to the one that Trump 7 years ago ripped up, saying it was a horrible, horrible deal. It should never, ever, ever have been done. And it was an absolute outrage. And against the kind of pleas of the European leaders to let it continue. And so the JCPOA collapses. And in fact, it had, by all accounts, been working really well. And now we're at a point where Iran is actually really close to being able to produce some kind of nuclear weapon, something which most of the world thinks is a really terrible idea. And we're the US is scrambling.
Yeah. There's some experts suggesting that they are weeks away from developing weapons grade, with the 60% now uranium enrichment towards 90%, which is weapons grade. Richard, the other point to raise here is that, and let's just take a look at this, in fact. Today, the Iranian foreign minister in Moscow suggesting who should be the mediator, the Russians. Let's take a look.
We are ready to help and mediate, to play any role that will be helpful from the Iranian point of view and acceptable for the United States. We proceed from the fact that the only way to get an agreement, as the minister has just said, is to agree exclusively on nuclear issues.
Только что сказал господин министр, является договоренность исключительно по ядерным делам.
Richard, we're in a geopolitical Venn diagram of various crises here with Russia.
Smart move from the Iranians by bringing Russia in. We all know that Iran has a very astute diplomacy, very clever diplomats, and by playing the Russian card in the middle of the Ukraine crisis, they are complicating the task for Trump. Now, to me, the absolute and I would say tragic paradox is that on the one hand, we all wish for Iran not to have the nuclear bomb. But on the other hand, if you live in the world of Trump, you want that nuclear bomb because you know that's the only way to be respected by Trump. So he creates a world, the reality is by his lack of diplomacy, by his brutality, by his arrogance, he creates a world where countries like Iran do want the nuclear bomb more, because that's the only way, again, to resist a potential attack or whatever from Trump. So I see it as terrible. How can he, Donald Trump, convince a country like Iran to stop its nuclear bomb research and program, while the way he behaves show that if you are Iran, you just need this atomic bomb?
Well, I guess one area, Holly, is sheer financial alleviation of all of its problems and sanctions. And just set out for us, Holly, if you will, on the one hand, I think you've set out before this kind of tale of two lifestyles. You have the deep economic crisis, water crisis, basic cost of living, prices rocketing, and a very different lifestyle for some cronies, officials driving around in Maseratis, Rolls-Royce.
Yes, so that's the thing. Yes, sanctions have caused a lot. It has squeezed the Iranian economy over the years, and but that's not the only issue here. Some of the issues that have been, I would say, something that the Islamic Republic has created themselves, which is systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression. We forget that in 2022. There was an uprising known as Women Life Freedom, or the Masa Amini protests, and they were anti-regime in nature, and that historic anti-regime sentiment still persists. And You know, what's interesting is that when the original JCPOA was signed in 2015, Iranians celebrated that deal. They went to the streets and they actually danced as if the country had won a World Cup. They were so excited about change coming to their country. And now today with this deal, they're not, the excitement isn't the same way, because if this deal was to happen, yes, it would make the international community safer. But in the economic front, the socio-political front, this is a Band-Aid for the ordinary Iranians. And you're going to be getting mixed reactions on the ground that you weren't getting in 2015.
Holly, great to hear your thoughts on this. Let's move from Iran to London. 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, Parliament Square, Westminster, Court 1 of the UK Supreme Court, a landmark ruling delivered by Lord Patrick Hodge on the legal definition of the terms woman and sex under the Equalities Act. The judge's ruling settled a long-running dispute over whether trans women, biological males with gender recognition certificate, could legally be recognised as women and therefore access women-only spaces. The case originated in Edinburgh, where it's brought by a campaign group for Women Scotland who questioned a law brought by the Scottish Government in 2018. And it required all public bodies to have 50% of women representing them, and defined a woman as including anyone who had lived as a woman, who either had a gender recognition certificate or was seeking one. Now, Scottish courts had previously ruled in favour of trans women twice before it landed at the Supreme Court, and this was the upsum of the 88-page judgment.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination and harassment.
So that was going on inside the court. This is the reaction of women campaigners in Edinburgh watching that.
Decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
And a look at the front pages the following morning and for the past couple of days via UK-based charity sexmatters.org, which campaigns for the recognition of biological sex in law, policy and culture. This was the reaction of some of the pages. A victory, they call it. Notably, the judge had said this is not a victory of one group over another. And this was the reaction of trans campaigner Heather Herbert on the British public broadcaster, the BBC.
Well, obviously, I'm disappointed. No judge can tell me who I am. You know, if a judge was to tell you that you're not a woman, that you're a man, you would, it wouldn't change who you are. It wouldn't change how you feel. And it feels just like we're following in the footsteps of Trump's America.
OK, Vivian, two terms clarified. A woman is a biological woman, sex is binary. Tell me about the significance that you see of this ruling and the impact that we're already seeing in the UK.
Well, you know, the whole issue of gender rights has become kind of a touchstone. I mean, of course, in the US, as we saw in the 2024 presidential election, but also in many other countries. It'll be interesting to see what the ripple effect is, of course. I think they're going to have a tremendously difficult time implementing the finer details of this, because the fact is, had this been done 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it might have been a lot simpler. But you have a not insignificant amount of people now who regard themselves as non-binary. And whether you agree with that or not, that has really been a kind of rapidly evolving reality in a lot of the West, what we call the West. So I think that for Britain to now impose this and to actually roll this out in hospitals, prisons, restrooms, all sorts of public spaces is going to be very, very tricky.
Holly, we heard some of the campaigners. I spoke to one earlier. This is Helen Joyce, who said it changes the default, where if you are in a single space area as a woman, you feel more confident to say, if you believe there is a biological man in the changing room, that they shouldn't be in there, rather than roles reverse. I mean, for Vivian just mentioning one particular issue, it's become kind of embroiled, hasn't it, in this issue of a wider culture, or played a hand in Trump's ascension, I think, to the presidency too. Where do you see this issue? Because it's kind of been claimed by the MAGA movement, but it also has, probably ramifications for ordinary people, not just in the US, but across the UK and Europe.
Well, as you've noted, this is an issue that has been very much involved in the MAGA movement and has actually been part of the key debates in the lead up to the presidential election that US President Donald Trump has won. The reality is that whatever happens in the United States does have ramifications abroad. And so whether it's something that's considered more of a domestic issue, just look at the tariffs. At the end of the day, this whole sense of America first, like the whole point is we're going to give jobs to Americans, but those tariffs have ramifications everywhere and impact the economy. So I think if you look at it through that lens, you'll see that there are some commonalities with a lot of the agenda setting that the Trump administration is doing throughout.
I want to take a look as well, and your take on this, Richard and Lillian too, on how the British government has kind of been dealing with this. And there are many questions about actually the fact that this shouldn't have gone to court. It should have been dealt with by a prime ministerial level, setting out an agenda. So in the UK, the Labour government has found themselves in quite a tricky position about this, with the Prime Minister previously saying as Labour leader that he was trying to work out a way to best express himself. And the British opposition leader, Kemi Badenoch, picked up on this. She said it was a victory for all the women who had to go to court to fight for the clarification of rights that he already had. And she went on to press a political point. She said this: the era of Keir Starmer telling us women had penises has come to an end. Now, this goes back to Keir Starmer saying that you shouldn't say only women have cervixes. This went viral a few years ago. Let's take a look.
Is it transphobic to say only women have a cervix?
Well, it is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right. But Andrew, I don't think that...
So Rosie Duffield should not have said that. Can you explain to people watching why she should not have said that?
Well, Andrew, I don't think that we can just go through various things that people said.
I mean, these are bread and butter issues for populists to pick up on. Is your sense that this should not have needed to go to court?
Well, in a way, I find that such a judgment by the UK Supreme Court gives people, in general, a sense of security. There is nothing more terrible in society where you don't know where the limit, where the boundaries are. So there is this boundary that they have set up. And I understand that maybe good at this point of time. Viviane is really right. It should have come way earlier. But this is, I mean, probably there was no case put forward the UK Supreme Court at that time. But you may have your opinion, but when the law says something and when the highest court says something, I believe the society can behave, and it's easier for a society to behave when you have clear rules. This rule is clear, and I think a lot of women, I'm interested by the fact I did not know this case specifically, so when I knew you wanted to put it on the program, I researched. It was a case put forward by women. So it's important because it shows that among women you have a lot of discomfort with this issue on transgender and so on. So to me, I see it as a bit of relief.
Lillian, this may not have made the front pages of the press in Ukraine this week, but there is a wider point here, isn't there? There's these grey areas of legislation being clarified in each country. And I see a number of reports in Ukraine of border guards determining trans women to be men, not letting them cross the border to leave the country because, with martial law, men between 18 and 60 are banned from leaving the country. So there are other implications here too, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. I think in Ukraine, of course, this conversation happens, I wouldn't say at a national level yet, but at a more local level or among friends. I mean, I think actually you can see, in my opinion, that this is something that has been politicized, heavily politicized around the world, because of course, there are people who identify as non-binary or trans in Ukraine, but it's not an issue that's being debated in Parliament. Not only and not mostly because obviously there are much bigger issues like the existential threat of the country's existence, but I think you could see that basically it gets picked up by politicians in various countries, and they actually make this a part of their platform. So in Ukraine, there's no space for that, for politicians to do things like that. However, I think, of course, like you said, there are instances where it does come up, and where likely as a result of an unfortunately relatively high rate of men trying to illegally leave the country to avoid military service, you perhaps would have border guards who think that, a trans woman or, a man might be trying to use that to get out of the country illegally, right? Or something like that. So,
no, I hear you. It takes us to another area. Thank you, Lilian, on that. Let's move on to what will take us into the weekend, possibly, because if we go 8,000 kilometres west of London, across the Atlantic to Corn Ranch, Van Horn, Texas, where 6 women, 3 of them celebrities, huddled into a space capsule of 15 cubic metres this week to sit at the tip of a reusable rocket run by Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin. On board, one of them, Lauren Sanchez, Jeff Bezos' fiancée, told the press, "Jeff, if you don't want to marry me, you don't have to send me to space." Also lifting off was singer Katy Perry, CBS broadcaster Gayle King, film producer Kerry-Ann Flynn, former NASA rocket scientist Aisha Bowe, and bioastronautics scientist Amanda Nguyen. Off they shot, you can see them here, to the Kármán line, 100 kilometres above Earth, where they experienced a few moments of weightlessness. Let's take a look at their moment of zen.
I haven't seen it. I want to see it myself.
1, 2, 3, take us space! Woo! Behind you, look right behind you. It's okay, you're it up there. Flynn, I got you. I got you, Flynn. Oh, the moon! You guys, I don't have to tell you. Look at the moon. Look. Okay. Look at the moon. Oh my gosh. So much. Whoa.
OK, in all, it was a round trip of 10 minutes, 20 seconds, minimum deposit per person, $150,000. It's not clear who paid for who or whether they paid at all. They were delighted. They got rave reviews. The end. No, of course it wasn't. The critical backlash began before their floating feet had even hit the ground. Celebrities piled on. American actress Oliver Wilde called it a wasteful publicity stunt, all those billions for a few internet memes. I want to go around 30 seconds for each person, started with you, Vivian, then Richard, then Lilian, and then Holly. Is this a cheap or expensive publicity stunt or a worthwhile cause, a step towards space tourism?
Tone-deaf political stunt by multi-gazillionaires who apparently are now super powerful in the United States.
Full stop. Richard.
Yes, I do agree, and I would add the word a bit insane. Insane, not because, I understand these women were happy to be there in space and to feel the loss of gravity, but frankly speaking, do we want to transform space into a new mass tourism destination or tourism for billionaires? No, I'm afraid of that, and I don't feel neither proud nor happy when I see those images.
Lilian.
I think the only thing I have to say is that I think some of it's being portrayed as some kind of, feminine or female achievement of these women in these, basically sexy outfits going into space. And I think it's a bit of an insult to the women astronauts that have actually, changed the game and made inroads for women in NASA and things like that.
Yes.
So I lots of reasons why I would find this insulting.
Holly, are you going to disagree and say, no, this is absolutely a fundamental, necessary endeavour?
No, I would hate to break it to you, Gavin. What I think really irked people was just the timing itself. you know, just the economy and people losing their savings because of those tariffs that came and went before anybody could really figure out what was going on. And, you know, this isn't the first time that people are going to space for tourism. What's so special about it this time? Just because a billionaire is promoting his girlfriend and some celeb friends? I don't get the point, frankly.
Punto final. Noted, Holly. Just before we go this week, a couple of things, and a thank you to all of you. I thought for Cécile Collet today and Jacques Paris, because they are two French nationals being held in Iran. It's almost 3 years now. The French government sending out a note today saying it's 1,076 days of their detention, arrested alleged spies, they say, and the French government says they were visiting as tourists in Iran. Thank you all. Superb insight, unique clarity. As always, for distinguished correspondents and analysts, thank you so much to my panel this week. We have Richard Worley from Blick. We have Vivian Wall from Time Magazine. We also have in Washington, Holly Dagres, Iranian commentator and analyst, and Lillian Bivings, thank you, the business editor for the Kyiv Independent in the Ukrainian capital. Thank you to all of you. I will leave you with a theme park like screams of the NS-31 space mission as it descended back to Earth. Stay grounded. We'll see you in 7 days for the world next week.
Perception, there it is.
Touchdown. Congratulations and welcome back to Earth.